When the 1967 Cadillac Eldorado was in development, the engineers at Milford were running it against European GT benchmarks. Cadillac's marketing department called it a luxury car. Both of them were right, and only one of those stories has ever been told. If you know the Eldorado at all, you probably know it as a certain kind of American excess. A long hood, a vinyl roof, a car built for boulevards, not back roads. That image isn't wrong exactly, it's just incomplete, and it belongs to a different car than the one that actually launched the nameplate's most important era. To understand what happened, you have to go back to a man named Bill Mitchell. Mitchell took over as GM's vice president of design in 1958, inheriting the job from Harley Earl, the man who essentially invented the profession of automotive styling in America. Earl's era was about chrome, tail fins, and spectacle. Mitchell's instincts ran differently. He'd spent time around European coach builders, around Ferraris and Jaguars, and he had a specific obsession. He wanted American cars to handle like they looked fast, not just look fast while wallowing through a corner like a boat. By the mid-1960s, that obsession had a target. GM was developing the new front-wheel drive personal luxury platform, shared in its underpinnings with the upcoming Buick Riviera and Oldsmobile Tornado. On paper, this was a luxury segment project. In the design studio, under Mitchell's direction, it became something else. The brief that circulated through his team wasn't build a smoother Cadillac. It was closer to build something that could stand next to a European Grand Tourer and not embarrass itself. That's the part almost nobody remembers. The 1967 Eldorado wasn't styled as a status symbol first and engineered as an afterthought. It was engineered with a genuine performance target, and the styling followed from that intent. The low beltline, the crisp, unornamented sheet metal, the way the greenhouse sat on the body. All of it was Mitchell pushing against the era's instinct to pile on decoration. He wanted discipline. He wanted a silhouette that read as tense, not soft. So why did this GT-brained car end up wearing a Cadillac badge and riding on a shared Buick-Cadillac architecture instead of becoming its own standalone performance model? Because in 1966, that's simply how General Motors operated. The corporation was organized around shared platforms and divisional badge engineering, and no division got to build a halo car in isolation. If Mitchell wanted his GT vision to reach production at all, it had to be smuggled inside a program that made business sense to the accountants, a personal luxury coupe aimed at a buyer who wanted a two-door flagship, not a sports car. The platform sharing wasn't the compromise imposed on the design. It was the vehicle, literally, that let the design happen at all. This is the part of the story that gets skipped, because the finished product photographs like a luxury car, and the sales brochures sold it as one. But underneath the skin, engineers made choices that had nothing to do with luxury car convention. Start with the steering. The 1967 Eldorado used variable ratio steering, quicker off-center and progressively slower as you wound in more lock, roughly a 14.5 to 1 ratio near center, opening up toward 18 to 1. That's not a spec you put on a car designed purely to waft. That's a spec you put on a car meant to respond precisely when a driver wants precision, while still staying calm and stable at speed. It's a compromise aimed squarely at a driver who cares about how the car turns, not just how it rides. Then there's the chassis work itself, developed and validated at Milford Proving Ground, the same facility where GM benchmarked and tuned vehicles against rivals, including imports. The Eldorado's suspension tuning wasn't lifted wholesale from an existing Cadillac sedan and softened further. It was worked over specifically for this car, with an eye toward controlling body motion and keeping the front-wheel drive layout composed under real cornering loads, not just in a straight line. And the powertrain backed it up. The 1967 Eldorado carried a 429 cubic inch V8, producing 340 horsepower, a genuinely potent engine for the era, in a car that weighed around 4,500 pounds. When Road and Track put it through their instrumented testing in March of 1967, they clocked 0 to 60 in 8.6 seconds. For a personal luxury coupe of that size and that weight, riding on a then unusual front-wheel drive layout, that number surprised people. It wasn't sports car quick, but it was quick enough that a magazine built around driving dynamics, not brochures, came away impressed by how the car actually moved. Put all of that together, The variable steering, the Milford-tuned chassis, the real straight-line performance, and you have a car that was, in engineering terms, a genuine grand tour. Not styled to look sporty, actually built to behave like one, wrapped in Cadillac's most disciplined design language of the decade. So what happened to that story? Cadillac's marketing happened to it. In 1967, Cadillac's entire brand identity was built on one word: luxury. Cushioned rides, isolation from the road, whisper quiet cabins. That's what the division's customers expected, and that's what their dealers knew how to sell. Cadillac wasn't in the business of chasing Jaguar or Ferrari on a magazine spec sheet, at least not publicly. So when this new Eldorado arrived, the marketing built around it had almost nothing to do with variable ratio steering or Milford chassis tuning. It talked about elegance. It talked about presence. It talked about the kind of buyer who had arrived, who deserved a personal flagship. That messaging worked. It sold cars, but it also buried the engineering story so completely that even the car's own identity started drifting to match the marketing rather than the other way around. Because here's the part that really explains why so few people today know any of this. The 1967 and 1968 Eldorados were not the template for what came after. Starting around 1969 and accelerating hard by 1970, the Eldorado grew. It got longer, heavier, softer. The steering ratios relaxed. The suspension tuning shifted toward isolation instead of control. The whole car's reason for being pivoted fully toward what the marketing department had been selling all along: pure personal luxury, with performance as a footnote instead of a founding principle. By the time most people who are old enough to remember the Eldorado nameplate actually encountered one in the early to mid-1970s, they were looking at the softened land-yacht version. That's the car that got remembered. That's the silhouette that stuck in cultural memory. Long, low, chrome-heavy, built for comfort. The lean, deliberately GT-influenced 1967 original got retroactively folded into that same story, treated as an early chapter of the land-yacht era, rather than what it actually was. The last moment this platform tried to be something else entirely. That's the reframe. The 1967 Eldorado wasn't the beginning of Cadillac going soft. It was the final expression of Bill Mitchell trying to keep American design honest to something European enthusiasts would recognize: restraint, precision, intent, right before the market pulled the whole project in the opposite direction. Today, values on these cars sit in a strange middle ground. Clean 1967 Eldorados typically trade somewhere between $18,000 and $38,000. Respectable numbers for a 50-plus-year-old American coupe, but nowhere near what you'd pay for a period European GT with a fraction of the engineering ambition behind it. Collectors who know the story chase these early cars specifically, understanding they're a different animal from the 70s and beyond. Most buyers don't know the difference. They see a big American coupe from the Eldorado's long run and assume it's all one story. It isn't. There's the car Bill Mitchell and the Milford engineers actually built, and there's the car Cadillac's marketing department needed it to be, so a luxury-first customer base would buy it without a second thought. For one brief 18-month production window, both of those cars existed inside the same body. And when the market forced GM to choose which one would survive, it chose the version history remembers and let the other one quietly disappear. But there's one more piece of this that deserves attention, because it explains why so many enthusiasts and even professional historians still get the timeline wrong. Look closely at what happened to Bill Mitchell's broader career after 1967, and you start to see a pattern. This wasn't the only project where his GT instincts collided with GM's sales machinery and lost. The same tension shows up in the Buick Riviera's evolution, in the way the Toronado's sharper early lines gradually rounded off, and in how Mitchell's personal favorite project, the original Corvette Stingray, got progressively softened by later committees who prioritized comfort options over the driving experience he'd fought to protect. The 1967 Eldorado isn't an isolated case of a GT vision getting smothered by marketing. It's one data point in a much larger story about what happened to an entire generation of American design ambition once corporate committees, emissions regulations, and changing buyer tastes started reshaping Detroit through the early 1970s. There's also a production detail that rarely makes it into the popular retelling. Cadillac built just over 17,000 Eldorados for the 1967 model year, a modest number by American standards, especially compared to the hundreds of thousands of full-size Cadillacs the division moved in the same period. That scarcity wasn't an accident. The Eldorado was never meant to be a volume seller. It was a halo car, a rolling statement about what the division was capable of when its best designers were given room to actually execute a vision instead of compromise one. Low production numbers plus a genuinely distinct engineering approach should have made this car legendary in the way certain limited-run European GTs became legendary. Instead, because Cadillac's marketing muted the story instead of amplifying it, the car slipped into a strange kind of obscurity. Famous enough to remember the name, obscure enough that almost nobody remembers what actually made it special. That's the real tragedy hiding underneath this story. It's not that the 1967 Eldorado was forgotten. Plenty of old cars get forgotten. It's that this one was deliberately mismarketed into obscurity by the very company that built it. Because telling the true story would have meant admitting Cadillac was chasing European engineering credibility instead of simply assuming American buyers already trusted the brand. 50-some years later, that decision is still shaping what people believe about this car, and about Cadillac's design history more broadly. Correcting it means going back past the brochures, past the badge, and looking at what Milford's engineers and Bill Mitchell's studio actually built when nobody outside GM was watching. If you want the real story behind the cars everyone thinks they already know, this is exactly what this channel does. Subscribe, because the next one might rewrite something you've believed for years.